The lute string snaps with a sharp crack that echoes through the royal chamber like a gunshot. For a moment, the only sound is your heart pounding as King Henry VIII's eyes slowly turn toward you. His face, already flushed from wine and anger, darkens further. You've just made a mistake that could cost you more than your position. It could cost your head. Welcome to the Tudor court, 1536, where a single wrong note could be treason, and where being the king's favorite musician today means absolutely nothing if you displease him tomorrow. 6 months earlier, you stood in the antechamber of Greenwich Palace, clutching your lute and trying to calm the trembling in your hands. The summons had come unexpectedly. King Henry VIII was seeking new musicians for his court, and your reputation as a skilled performer in London's taverns had somehow reached royal ears. The palace corridors buzzed with whispered conversations about the king's recent marriage to Anne Boleyn and the growing tensions with Rome or his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. But as a common musician, such grand political matters seemed as distant as the stars. Your concerns were more immediate: the worn patches on your best doublet, the slight warping in your lute's neck, and the knowledge that this audition could either elevate you beyond your wildest dreams or destroy any hope of advancement. Thomas Tallis, the king's principal composer, emerged from the royal chambers with the grave expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. At 41, Tallis had already survived more royal musical fashions and political upheavals than most courtiers could imagine. His longevity in service spoke to both his exceptional talent and his remarkable ability to navigate the treacherous currents of Tudor court life. "His Majesty will see you now," Tallis said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had delivered this message to countless hopeful musicians, many of whom had left the palace in shame or worse. "Remember, play what he requests, not what you think he should hear. The king's tastes are particular." The throne room was more magnificent than anything you had ever imagined. Tapestries depicting the king's victories adorned the walls, while carved wooden beams stretched overhead like the ribs of some great beast. Courtiers in silk and velvet lined the walls, their faces masks of careful neutrality as they observed the proceedings. And there, seated on a throne that seemed to command the very air around it, was Henry VIII himself. The king was 35 years old in 1536, still bearing traces of the handsome prince who had captivated Europe in his youth, but already showing signs of the bloated tyrant he would become. His red gold beard was meticulously groomed, his doublet cut from cloth that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and his small, pale eyes held an intelligence that missed nothing and forgot less. "So," he said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber, "you are the musician my agents have told me about. What is your name, and what instrument do you claim to master?" You stepped forward, bowing as deeply as you could manage without dropping your lute. "I am William Cornish, your Majesty, son of the late musician of the same name. I play the lute, and I have some small skill with composition." The mention of your father's name caused a slight shift in the king's expression. William Cornish the Elder had served Henry's father, Henry VII, with distinction, creating elaborate court entertainments and musical spectacles. The connection provided you with a thin thread of credibility, though you wondered whether it might also create unreasonable expectations. "Cornish," the king mused, leaning back in his throne. "I remember your father. He understood that music serves the crown, not the other way around. We shall see if that understanding runs in the family." He gestured toward a chair placed near the throne. "Play for us something of your own composition. We wish to hear what musical ideas flow through Cornish blood." This was the moment you had prepared for, yet no amount of practice could have readied you for performing under the direct gaze of the most powerful man in England. You settled into the chair, positioned your lute, and began to play the piece. You had composed specifically for this audition a complex melody that showcased your technical skill, while remaining accessible to royal tastes. The music flowed through the chamber, and you became aware that every person present was holding their breath. This was more than an audition. It was a test that would determine not just your employment prospects, but your entire future. In Henry's court, failure was not simply disappointing. It could be dangerous. As you played, you noticed the king's expression gradually changing. The suspicious wariness that had marked his initial assessment gave way to something approaching appreciation. His foot began to tap in rhythm with your melody, and his eyes lost some of their harsh intensity. When you finished, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, King Henry began to applaud. The sound of his hands clapping was immediately echoed by every courtier in the room. Though you suspected their enthusiasm had more to do with reading the king's mood than genuine appreciation of your performance. "Excellent," the king declared, rising from his throne. "You have inherited your father's skill, though your style is more modern. We approve." He turned to Tallis. "See that Master Cornish is provided with appropriate quarters and informed of his duties. He shall join our musical household immediately." As you bowed again, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of your circumstances, the king added something that would prove prophetic. "Remember, Master Cornish, that in our court, music is never merely entertainment. It is an expression of our will, our pleasure, and our power. Those who serve us well shall be rewarded beyond their dreams. Those who disappoint us—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, but his meaning was unmistakable. Your first weeks at court were a crash course in survival skills that had nothing to do with music. The Tudor court was a complex ecosystem of competing factions, shifting alliances, and unspoken rules that could destroy the unwary. As a musician, you occupied a unique position, valuable enough to have access to intimate royal gatherings, but expendable enough to be discarded without significant political consequences. Your quarters were in a section of the palace reserved for household staff and minor officials. The room was small but private, with a window overlooking the palace gardens and furnishings that, while simple, were far superior to anything you had known in your previous life. More importantly, you had access to a practice room equipped with various instruments and a small library of musical scores. Thomas Tallis took personal responsibility for your education in court protocols. During your first morning as a royal musician, he outlined the fundamental rules that governed your new existence. "First and most important," he explained as you walked through the palace corridors, "never assume that anything you see or hear is private. The king has informants throughout the court, and conversations that seem casual can be reported back to him within hours." He paused at a window overlooking the courtyard where courtiers were engaged in various activities. "Second, remember that your primary loyalty must always be to the king personally, not to any faction or individual courtier. Queens, ministers, and favorites come and go. The king endures." This lesson would prove particularly relevant given the current political climate. Anne Boleyn's position as queen was already generating controversy and opposition. Catherine of Aragon still had supporters who considered her the rightful queen, while many traditional Catholics viewed Anne's marriage as invalid. As a court musician, you would inevitably be exposed to these tensions. "Third," Tallis continued, "understand that every performance is a political act. The songs you choose, the way you perform them, even your facial expressions while playing, all of these communicate messages that will be interpreted by everyone present." He led you to the music room where you would spend much of your time. The space was well appointed with various instruments, comfortable seating for rehearsals, and shelves lined with manuscripts. Several other musicians were already present, practicing or reviewing scores. "Allow me to introduce our new colleague," Tallis announced. "William Cornish, son of the musician who served His Majesty's father. He'll be joining our musical household." The other musicians greeted you with varying degrees of warmth. Some seemed genuinely pleased to have another skilled performer in their ranks, while others appeared to view you as potential competition for the king's favor. You quickly learned that court musicians, like all courtiers, or constantly competing for royal attention and the rewards that came with it. Mark Smeaton, a young man perhaps 5 years your senior, stood out among the group. He was undeniably handsome, with dark hair and expressive eyes that seemed to captivate everyone around him. His skill with the lute was exceptional, and his voice had a quality that could reduce listeners to tears or lift them to ecstasy. "Welcome to our little musical family," Smeaton said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I trust you'll find court life educational." There was something in his tone that suggested complexity beneath the surface, but you were too overwhelmed by your new circumstances to analyze it carefully. Only later would you understand the dangers that Smeaton's particular situation represented. Your first performance as a court musician came that very evening during the king's private dinner. The royal dining chamber was an intimate space by palace standards, accommodating perhaps 20 people. The king sat at the head of a long table, with Queen Anne at his right hand and various courtiers arranged according to their rank and favor. The musical entertainment was expected to be subtle, background accompaniment that enhanced the mood without overwhelming conversation. You positioned yourself with 2 other musicians in an alcove near the windows, your lute ready to blend with a small consort of viols. As you played, you became aware of the complex social dynamics unfolding around the dinner table. Conversations were carried on in layers, with surface topics concealing deeper political meanings. Glances and gestures carried information that was carefully observed and interpreted by everyone present. Queen Anne, you noticed, was particularly attentive to the musical entertainment. She occasionally made requests for specific pieces, and her appreciation seemed genuine rather than merely polite. This attention was both flattering and slightly unsettling. You had heard enough court gossip to know that royal favor could be dangerous as well as beneficial. The king himself seemed distracted during the meal, engaging in conversation with various courtiers, but often staring into the distance with an expression that suggested he was contemplating matters far from the immediate social gathering. When he did focus on the music, his attention was intense and analytical, as if he were evaluating not just the performance, but the performers themselves. After the dinner concluded and the royal party dispersed, Tallis approached you with a satisfied expression. "Well done for a first performance. You blend well with the ensemble, and you chose appropriate pieces for the occasion." "It felt like walking through a minefield," you admitted. "An accurate comparison," he replied, "and one you would do well to remember. In this court, survival depends on understanding that every moment is a performance. Every word is scrutinized, and every relationship is subject to sudden change." Life as a Tudor court musician followed rhythms that were dictated by the king's schedule, the church calendar, and the endless succession of ceremonies that marked royal existence. Your days began before dawn with private practice, continued through various performances and rehearsals, and often extended late into the evening when the court required musical entertainment. The king's daily routine was elaborate and formal, with music playing a role in almost every aspect. Morning prayers in the royal chapel required skilled singers and instrumentalists to provide appropriate sacred music. Meals demanded background entertainment that enhanced the dining experience without overwhelming conversation. Afternoon activities might include hunting expeditions that required musicians to provide fanfares and celebration, or intimate gatherings where more personal musical entertainment was expected. Evenings were often the most demanding time for court musicians. The king enjoyed elaborate entertainments that might include dancing, theatrical performances, and extended musical programs. These events could last for hours, requiring musicians to maintain both high performance standards and constant awareness of the political undercurrents that influenced every aspect of court life. Your accommodation to this schedule was gradual but total. Within weeks, you found yourself thinking in terms of royal time, when the king wanted music, when he preferred silence, what moods might influence his musical preferences, and how external political events might affect his emotional state, and, consequently, his entertainment requirements. The other musicians became your primary social circle, partly by necessity and partly by choice. Court life was isolating for people who weren't born into aristocratic families, and musicians found natural companionship with others who shared their professional challenges and social position. Mark Smeaton proved to be particularly engaging company. His wit and musical talent made him popular throughout the court, and his apparent confidence in navigating social complexities was something you found both admirable and slightly envious. He had a gift for making conversation with courtiers of all ranks, from kitchen servants to noble lords, and his ability to entertain seemed effortless. The secret, he explained during one of your evening conversations, is understanding that everyone here wants something. The key is figuring out what that something is and how your musical skills might help them achieve it. This philosophy seemed to be working well for Smeaton. He received regular gifts from appreciative courtiers, was frequently invited to private gatherings, and appeared to have achieved a level of security that most court musicians could only dream of. His particular friendship with Queen Anne was often remarked upon, though always in terms that emphasized his musical services rather than any personal relationship. The seasonal cycle of court life brought constant variety to your musical duties. Christmas celebrations required elaborate sacred music and secular entertainment that could last for weeks. Easter brought its own musical demands, with complex liturgical requirements and opportunities for composers to showcase their skills. Summer hunting seasons meant outdoor performances and the unique challenges of providing music in natural settings. Each season also brought the possibility of royal progresses, extended journeys where the king would visit various parts of his realm, staying at the estates of noble subjects and requiring full musical accompaniment throughout. These progresses were both exciting opportunities to see the country and exhausting endurance tests that could last for months. Your first royal progress came in the summer of 1536, when the king decided to visit several estates in the home counties. The logistics of moving the royal household, including all its musical requirements, were staggering. Instruments had to be carefully packed and transported. Music libraries had to be portable, and musicians had to be prepared to perform in unfamiliar venues with varying acoustic properties. The progress also provided your first extended exposure to the king in more relaxed settings, away from the formal protocols of palace life. Henry's personality became more apparent. Though no less dangerous, he was genuinely knowledgeable about music, with opinions on everything from compositional technique to performance style. He could be charming and generous when pleased, but his displeasure was swift and often disproportionate to its cause. During one memorable evening at a noble's estate, the king requested that you perform a solo piece of your own composition. The setting was intimate, a small chamber with perhaps a dozen listeners, including the king and queen. You chose a piece that you had been working on privately, a complex melody that incorporated some of the more modern musical ideas that were beginning to influence English composition. The performance went well, with the king nodding approvingly at particularly skillful passages. When you finished, he gestured for you to approach his chair. "That was interesting," he said, his tone giving no clear indication of his assessment. "The harmonic structure shows continental influence. Where did you encounter such ideas?" This was a dangerous moment. Continental musical ideas often came from Catholic regions that were currently in political opposition to England's religious reforms. Your answer could be interpreted as revealing dangerous foreign sympathies from manuscripts in Your Majesty's own library. You replied carefully, "I have been studying the techniques of various composers to better serve your musical requirements." The king's expression brightened. "Excellent. We approve of musicians who seek to expand their knowledge in service to the crown. Continue developing such pieces, but ensure that they always serve English purposes rather than foreign ones." The relief you felt at successfully navigating this interrogation was overwhelming, but it also served as a reminder of how quickly Innocent musical choices could become political statements in the Tudor court. As autumn approached in 1536, the political atmosphere at court grew increasingly tense. Queen Anne had not yet produced the male heir that Henry desperately needed, and her position was becoming more precarious. The king's attention was beginning to wander toward other women, most notably Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. These shifting romantic and political currents had direct implications for court musicians. Anne had been a generous patron of music, commissioning new compositions and providing opportunities for musicians to advance their careers. Her potential fall from favor threatened not just her own future, but the prospects of everyone associated with her household. Mark Smeaton's position was particularly vulnerable. His close relationship with the Queen had provided him with exceptional access and influence. But it also made him a target for anyone seeking to damage Anne's reputation. Court gossip, always vicious, was beginning to hint at improprieties that went far beyond the bounds of appropriate musical service. "You need to be careful," Tallis warned during one of your private conversations. "The king's moods are becoming unpredictable, and anyone closely associated with the Queen may find themselves under scrutiny." This warning proved prophetic. In early autumn, several courtiers who had been close to Anne began experiencing the king's displeasure. Some were dismissed from their positions, others found themselves excluded from royal gatherings, and a few simply disappeared from court without explanation. The musical household tried to maintain normal routines while navigating these treacherous political currents. Performances continued as scheduled, but the atmosphere was strained. Musicians found themselves choosing repertoire more carefully, avoiding pieces that might be too closely associated with the Queen or that might remind the king of his changing feelings toward his marriage. Your own position seemed relatively secure. You were new enough to court that you hadn't developed strong associations with any particular faction, and your musical skills were valued independently of political considerations. But you couldn't escape the growing sense that catastrophe was approaching. The crisis came in early November with shocking suddenness. Mark Smeaton was arrested on charges of adultery with Queen Anne. The accusation was almost certainly false. Smeaton's social position made such a relationship virtually impossible. But in Henry's court, truth was less important than political necessity. The arrest sent shock waves through the musical household. If Smeaton could be destroyed on such charges, no one was safe. The king's wrath, once aroused, recognized no limits of rank, previous, service, or rational probability. Within days, additional arrests followed. Henry Norris, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, was charged with similar crimes. William Brereton, another courtier, was also taken. Most shocking of all, Anne's own brother, George Bowen, was arrested and charged with incest with the Queen. The court transformed overnight from a center of artistic and cultural achievement into a place of paranoia and fear. Conversations became guarded, friendships dissolved, and everyone sought to distance themselves from anything that might be construed as association with the doomed Queen. For the musical household, the practical implications were immediate and severe. Anne had been a major patron of new music, and many recent compositions had been created specifically for her enjoyment. These pieces suddenly became dangerous to perform, as they might remind the king of his estranged wife and provoke his anger. The trial of Smeaton and the other accused men was swift and predetermined. Under torture, Smeaton confessed to adultery with the Queen, a confession that was almost certainly false, but provided the legal pretext for the destruction of Anne and her associates. Watching from the edges of the court as these events unfolded, you began to understand the true nature of royal service. Musical talent and artistic achievement were valuable only as long as they served the king's immediate needs. When political circumstances changed, years of faithful service could be erased in moments, and lives could be destroyed to satisfy royal whims. The executions took place on May 17, 1536. Mark Smeaton, The talented young musician who had welcomed you to court just months earlier died along with the other accused men. His crime was not adultery, but the mistake of becoming too closely associated with a queen who had fallen from favor. 2 days later, Anne Boleyn herself was executed, and within 24 hours, the king was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The speed of these transitions was breathtaking in its brutality and efficiency. Jane Seymour's elevation to queen brought immediate changes to court life that affected every aspect of the musical establishment. Where Anne had been sophisticated, cultured, and actively interested in artistic innovation, Jane was simpler in her tastes and more traditional in her approach to royal entertainment. The new queen's musical preferences reflected her personality and background. She favored English compositions over continental works, traditional melodies over experimental harmonies, and religious music over secular entertainment. These preferences weren't merely personal choices. They represented political statements about the direction of Henry's court and kingdom. For musicians, adapting to Jane's tastes required careful recalibration of repertoire and performance style. The complex, sophisticated pieces that had pleased Anne Boleyn were suddenly inappropriate. Instead, the musical household had to emphasize the kind of straightforward, melodious compositions that appealed to more conventional tastes. This transition was particularly challenging for you personally because your compositional style had been influenced by the more modern approaches that Anne had encouraged. The pieces you had been working on, with their continental harmonic structures and experimental techniques, were now potentially problematic rather than advantageous. Thomas Tallis, with his characteristic wisdom and adaptability, helped guide the musical household through this transition. Remember, he counseled, our job is to serve the crown, not to pursue artistic innovation for its own sake. A musician who cannot adapt to changing circumstances is a musician who will not survive. The practical implications of this philosophy became clear during your first performance for the new queen. The setting was a private evening entertainment in the royal apartments, with Queen Jane surrounded by her new ladies-in-waiting and a small group of favorite courtiers. You had chosen a simple English ballad that emphasized melodic beauty over technical complexity. The piece was well within your capabilities, but performing it required suppressing your natural inclination toward the more sophisticated musical language you had been developing. Queen Jane's response was notably positive. She smiled throughout the performance, occasionally humming along with familiar passages, and applauded with genuine enthusiasm when you finished. The contrast with Anne Boleyn's more analytical appreciation was striking. Where Anne had listened like a knowledgeable critic, Jane responded like an appreciative audience member. That was lovely, she said after the performance. Such beautiful, clear melody. We prefer music that speaks to the heart rather than challenges the mind. This comment, while meant as praise, contained an implicit criticism of the more complex musical styles that had flourished under the previous regime, and also served as guidance for future performances. The new queen valued emotional directness over intellectual sophistication. The king's own musical preferences seemed to be evolving in parallel with his new marriage. Henry had always been a competent musician himself, with skills in composition and performance that were genuinely impressive. But his recent musical interests appeared to be shifting toward the more traditional styles that his new wife preferred. During one memorable evening in the royal music room, the king called for you to accompany him in a duet that he had composed. The piece was skillfully written but conservative in its harmonic language and structure. Performing with the king required not just musical competence, but also psychological dexterity. You needed to complement his playing without overwhelming it, support his musical ideas without showing off your own technical abilities. Music should unite people, the king commented after your performance together, not divide them with unnecessary complexity. The greatest compositions are those that can be appreciated by learned and simple listeners alike. This philosophy represented a significant shift from the more experimental approaches that had been encouraged under Anne Boleyn's influence. It also reflected broader political and religious changes that were reshaping English culture under Henry's increasingly authoritarian rule. The musical household adapted to these new expectations with varying degrees of success. Some musicians, particularly those who had been closely associated with Anne Boleyn's court, found themselves gradually marginalized despite their technical skills. Others, including yourself, worked to develop repertoires and performance styles that better suited the new regime's preferences. One unexpected consequence of these changes was the increased importance of sacred music in court entertainment. Queen Jane's piety was genuine and pronounced, and she frequently requested religious compositions for private performances. This created opportunities for musicians who were skilled in liturgical styles but also required careful navigation of the religious controversies that continued to divide English society. The king's break with Rome had created a complex religious situation that affected every aspect of court life, including music. Traditional Catholic liturgical music was still widely used, but references to papal authority had to be eliminated. New Protestant compositions were being created, but they often lacked the sophistication and beauty of older Catholic works. As a court musician, you found yourself walking a fine line between honoring England's musical traditions and avoiding anything that might be construed as support for Catholic political positions. This required constant awareness of both musical and theological implications of every piece you performed. By the spring of 1537, you had developed the essential skills that allowed court musicians to survive in the Tudor environment: acute sensitivity to political currents, the ability to adapt your musical style to changing royal preferences, and, most importantly, the wisdom to remain inconspicuous while still being useful. The lesson of Mark Smeaton's fate was never far from your mind. His talent had been exceptional, his service to the court exemplary, and his personal conduct apparently blameless. But his association with the wrong political faction at the wrong time had destroyed him completely. The randomness of his destruction was perhaps the most frightening aspect. It suggested that survival depended as much on luck as on skill or virtue. Your strategy for avoiding similar dangers involved what you came to think of as strategic mediocrity, being good enough at your job to remain valuable, but not so exceptional that you attracted dangerous attention. This meant restraining your natural musical ambitions and focusing instead on reliable competence. The approach required constant self-discipline. When you composed new pieces, you chose familiar forms and conventional harmonic progressions, rather than exploring the innovative techniques that genuinely interested you. When you performed, you emphasized blend and support rather than individual brilliance. When you interacted with courtiers, you remained polite but unremarkable. This strategy seemed to be working. Queen Jane showed consistent satisfaction with your musical services, and the king had made several approving comments about your reliability and professionalism. You received regular wages, comfortable accommodations, and the social status that came with royal employment. For someone from your background, these benefits represented remarkable success. But the psychological cost of strategic mediocrity was higher than you had anticipated. Suppressing your artistic ambitions felt like slowly suffocating a part of your identity. The music you really wanted to create remained locked inside your mind, too dangerous to share even with trusted colleagues. The isolation was particularly difficult. Court musicians lived in a strange social limbo, too elevated to maintain friendships with common people, but too humble to be accepted as equals by genuine courtiers. The recent executions had made even professional relationships fraught with suspicion and fear. Thomas Tallis remained your primary confidant and guide, but even with him, you found yourself being carefully guarded. The events surrounding Anne Boleyn's fall had demonstrated that anyone could become dangerous to know if circumstances changed. Friendship itself had become a luxury that court servants could barely afford. The arrival of foreign diplomats and visitors occasionally provided welcome relief from the claustrophobic atmosphere of English court life. These guests often brought different perspectives on music and culture that reminded you of the broader world beyond Henry's immediate influence. One such visitor was a Flemish composer named Adrian Willaert, who had come to England as part of a diplomatic mission from the Holy Roman Empire. His presence at court provided a rare opportunity to hear continental musical innovations and to discuss compositional techniques with someone who operated outside the constraints of English political considerations. During a private conversation in the palace music room, Willaert shared his observations about English musical life. "Your court has exceptional musicians," he noted, "but they seem constrained, as if they're holding back their true capabilities. Is this?" Observation was uncomfortably accurate. Court service requires certain adaptations. He replied carefully. "I understand political necessity," Willaert continued, "but art suffers when it becomes too subservient to power. The greatest music emerges from the tension between creative freedom and social responsibility, not from complete submission to authority." This conversation stayed with you long after Willaert's departure. His perspective reminded you of musical possibilities that you had been forced to abandon, and it highlighted the creative costs of your survival strategy. The summer of 1537 brought unexpected opportunities for more adventurous musical work. Queen Jane announced her pregnancy, and the court's mood brightened considerably as preparations began for the heir that Henry had sought for so long. The celebratory atmosphere created space for more elaborate entertainments and innovative compositions. You were commissioned to create a piece celebrating the expected royal birth. The assignment was both an honor and a challenge. It needed to be sophisticated enough to reflect the magnitude of the occasion while remaining accessible to the broad range of listeners who would hear it. Working on this composition allowed you to stretch your creative muscles for the first time in months. You incorporated some of the harmonic innovations you had been developing privately, but within a framework that remained familiar and comfortable for court audiences. The result was a piece that satisfied your artistic ambitions while meeting practical requirements. The premiere took place during a grand court celebration in August. The performance was successful, with both the king and queen expressing satisfaction with your work. More importantly, the piece demonstrated that you could create sophisticated music without venturing into politically dangerous territory. This success marked a turning point in your court career. You began to understand that survival and artistic achievement weren't necessarily incompatible. They simply required more careful navigation than you had initially realized. October 12, 1537, marked one of the most important dates in Tudor history, the birth of Prince Edward, Henry VIII's long-awaited male heir. The arrival of a son after decades of matrimonial turmoil and political crisis transformed the atmosphere at court overnight. The king's joy was overwhelming and infectious, creating opportunities for celebration that had been impossible during the tense years of marriage conflicts and religious upheaval. For the musical household, the prince's birth meant weeks of continuous performance as the court celebrated with unprecedented enthusiasm. Every aspect of the festivities required musical accompaniment, from solemn Te Deums in the royal chapel to raucous secular celebrations in the great halls. You found yourself busier than at any point since joining the court. The demand for new compositions was constant, as the king wanted music that specifically celebrated his son's arrival rather than repurposing existing pieces. This created both opportunities and challenges, chances to showcase your creative abilities, but also pressure to produce high-quality work under tight deadlines. The composition you had created for the anticipated birth was performed multiple times during the celebrations, and its success led to additional commissions. The king himself requested that you adapt the piece for different instrumental combinations, allowing it to be performed in various settings throughout the extended festivities. Queen Jane's triumph was complete, but tragically brief. 12 days after giving birth to the heir that secured Henry's dynasty, she died from complications related to childbirth. Her death cast a shadow over the celebrations and reminded everyone at court of the fragility of life and fortune. Even at the highest levels of society, the Queen's funeral required an entirely different kind of musical preparation. Be elaborate. Celebrations that had marked Prince Edward's birth were replaced by solemn ceremonies that honored Jane's sacrifice in providing the kingdom with its future king. The contrast between the joyful compositions you had recently created and the mournful pieces now required was stark and emotionally challenging. Working on funeral music for a queen you had served personally brought home the human cost of court life in ways that previous deaths had not. Jane Seymour had been kind to you, appreciative of your musical services, and genuinely interested in the artistic life of the court. Her death felt like a personal loss rather than simply another political development. The king's grief was profound and visible. Though it was complicated by his satisfaction at finally having a male heir, Henry wore mourning black for months, but he also began planning for Edward's future in ways that suggested his dynastic concerns outweighed his personal sorrow. 4. The musical household. The period following Jane's death was marked by uncertainty about future directions. The Queen had been a significant influence on court musical preferences, and her absence left a vacuum that no one seemed eager to fill. The king's own musical interests appeared to be evolving toward more serious, contemplative pieces that reflected his aging and the increasing burdens of kingship. Your position during this transitional period was more secure than it had been during previous royal changes. The success of your celebratory compositions for Prince Edward's birth had established your reputation as a reliable court composer, while your careful navigation of previous political crises had demonstrated your discretion and loyalty. Thomas Tallis, now in his early 40s, had achieved a level of security and influence that allowed him to shape the musical household's adaptation to changing circumstances. His guidance during this period was invaluable, helping you understand how to maintain professional momentum during times of court instability. The key, he explained, is remembering that the king's need for music doesn't diminish during periods of personal grief or political transition. If anything, it increases, because music provides emotional release and continuity that other court activities cannot offer. This insight proved accurate. Despite his mourning for Jane and his preoccupation with Edward's upbringing, Henry continued to require extensive musical entertainment. His preferences shifted toward more serious repertoire, complex sacred music, sophisticated instrumental pieces, and compositions that reflected the gravitas appropriate to his position as an aging monarch with heavy responsibilities. The winter of 1537–38 became a period of intense musical development for you personally. With the court's atmosphere more conducive to serious artistic work, you were able to explore compositional techniques and musical ideas that had been impractical. During the more politically charged periods of Anne Boleyn's reign and the early months of Jane Seymour's queenship, you began working on ambitious sacred composition, a setting of the Te Deum that incorporated some of the most sophisticated polyphonic techniques you had mastered. The piece was intended for performance during the major religious festivals, when the court's musical requirements allowed for longer, more complex works. The composition process was both challenging and satisfying, working within the constraints of liturgical requirements while exploring innovative harmonic and rhythmic possibilities required all of your technical skills and creative imagination. The piece represented the kind of serious musical achievement that you had dreamed of creating when you first joined the court. By the spring of 1538, Henry's court was buzzing with speculation about his next marriage. the king was only 36 years old, still capable of fathering more children, and clearly interested in securing his dynasty with additional heirs. The question wasn't whether he would remarry, but whom he would choose, and how that choice would affect the delicate political balance of English court life. The marriage negotiations that followed were complex international affairs that involved considerations of foreign policy, religious alignment, and personal compatibility. Various European princesses were considered and rejected as Henry's ambassadors. Sought a bride who would advance English interests while satisfying the king's personal requirements. For court musicians, these marriage discussions created both opportunities and anxieties. A new queen would inevitably bring changes to court culture and musical preferences, requiring adaptation to unfamiliar tastes and possibly different national traditions. The memory of how quickly circumstances had changed during previous royal marriages made everyone in the musical household nervous about what might be coming. The king's own musical activities during this period seemed to intensify, as he used composition and performance as outlets for his complex emotions about remarriage. He wrote several new pieces, some joyful and optimistic, others melancholy and reflective, that suggested his mixed feelings about seeking a fourth wife. Your role in court entertainment expanded during this period as Henry sought distraction. From the pressures of marriage negotiations and kingdom management, he frequently called for extended musical programs in the evenings, sometimes lasting several hours and requiring the full resources of the musical household. These evening concerts provided opportunities to perform your more ambitious compositions, including the Te Deum setting you had been developing. The king's response to your more serious musical work was encouraging. He seemed to appreciate the technical sophistication and artistic ambition that you had been forced to suppress during earlier periods. "Master Cornish," he commented after one particularly successful performance, "your musical development has been impressive to observe. You have inherited your father's skill, but developed your own distinctive voice. Such growth in service to the crown is commendable." This royal approval was both gratifying and slightly dangerous. Being noticed by the king was always a double-edged sword in Tudor court life. It could lead to advancement and rewards, but it also created expectations and vulnerability to royal displeasure if circumstances changed. The solution to Henry's marriage question came from an unexpected source: the German Protestant states, which were seeking stronger ties with England. As a counterweight to Catholic powers, Anne of Cleves, sister to the Duke of Cleves, was proposed as a bride who would strengthen England's Protestant alliances while bringing valuable political connections. The negotiations were conducted primarily through diplomatic channels, with Hans Holbein's famous portrait serving as Henry's introduction to his prospective bride. The painting presented Anne as an attractive, dignified woman whose appearance and bearing seemed suitable for queenship. When word reached court that the marriage had been agreed upon, the musical household began preparing for another major transition. German musical traditions were different from English ones, and Anne's arrival would likely bring new repertoire requirements and performance styles that would need to be mastered. Quickly, Thomas Tallis approached these preparations with his characteristic methodical thoroughness. He obtained examples of German sacred and secular music, studied their structural and stylistic characteristics, and began preparing arrangements that would allow the English musical household to perform them competently. Your own preparation involved intensive study of German musical styles and techniques. The harmonic language was somewhat different from what you were accustomed to, with greater emphasis on certain intervals and progressions that were less common in English composition. The rhythmic patterns also showed distinctive characteristics that required careful practice to master. The anticipation of Anne's arrival created an atmosphere of nervous excitement throughout the court. Everyone understood that a new queen meant new opportunities and new dangers, but no one could predict exactly what changes would come. or how they would affect individual careers and prospects. Your position seemed relatively secure. Your proven adaptability to changing royal preferences and your growing reputation as a reliable composer suggested that you would weather another royal transition successfully. But the memory of previous upheavals made it impossible to feel completely confident about the future. As 1538 drew to a close, you found yourself reflecting on the remarkable changes that had occurred during your 2.5 years of court service. You had witnessed the fall and execution of a queen, served through the brief reign of another, mourned her death in childbirth, and now prepared for the arrival of a third. Each transition had required personal and professional adaptations that had gradually transformed you from a simple musician into a sophisticated court performer capable of navigating complex political and cultural challenges. Anne of Cleves arrived in England on December 27, 1539, and the disaster began almost immediately. Henry's first meeting with his bride-to-be at Rochester Castle was a catastrophe of miscommunication and disappointed expectations that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone at court. The king had expected to find the attractive, sophisticated woman depicted in Holbein's portrait and described in diplomatic correspondence. Instead, he encountered someone whose appearance, manner, and cultural background were so different from his expectations that he immediately sought ways to escape the marriage. For the musical household, Henry's reaction to Anne created immediate complications. The German musical repertoire that had been prepared for her arrival suddenly became problematic rather than advantageous, performing music associated with the new queen might remind the king of his disappointment and provoke his displeasure. The wedding ceremony took place on January 6, 1540. Despite Henry's obvious reluctance, the king's mood during the festivities was so dark that even casual observers could sense his dissatisfaction. The musical entertainment, while technically competent, felt strained and artificial as everyone tried to maintain celebratory appearances. While knowing that the royal marriage was already failing, your own performance during the wedding celebrations required exceptional diplomatic sensitivity. You had prepared several pieces that incorporated German musical elements as a tribute to the new queen, but the king's obvious displeasure made it dangerous to emphasize Anne's foreign origins. Instead, you focused on more neutral repertoire that avoided both English nationalism and German cultural references. The weeks following the wedding were among the most tense and unpredictable of your court career. Henry made no secret of his desire to escape his marriage, while Anne struggled to adapt to English court life without understanding the political forces that were already working against her. Anne's musical preferences, when she expressed them, were quite different from those of previous queens. She favored simple, folk-influenced melodies over sophisticated polyphonic compositions, and she seemed more comfortable with communal singing than formal concert performances. These preferences weren't necessarily problematic in themselves, but they became associated with the king's overall dissatisfaction with his marriage. The crisis deepened when Henry began pursuing Anne Bassett, a young woman at court whose beauty and English background provided a stark contrast to his unwanted German wife. The king's romantic interests always had implications for court musicians, as they influenced both his emotional state and his preferences for entertainment. During this period, you found yourself walking an increasingly narrow line between various dangerous possibilities. Performing music that pleased Anne of Cleves might displease the king. Ignoring the queen's preferences might create problems with her household. Supporting any particular faction among the courtiers, competing for the king's favor could prove catastrophic if circumstances changed. Thomas Tallis's guidance during this crisis was invaluable. His decades of court experience had taught him how to navigate such situations with minimal risk. Focus on technical excellence, he advised. When politics are unstable, competence becomes the safest position. Don't take sides, don't make assumptions. And don't get emotionally invested in outcomes you cannot control. The resolution came with characteristic Tudor swiftness and brutality. In July 1540, the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled on grounds that it had never been legally valid. Anne accepted the annulment with remarkable grace, receiving a generous settlement that allowed her to live comfortably in England for the rest of her life. More shocking was the simultaneous destruction of Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had arranged the Cleves marriage. Cromwell was arrested, tried for treason, and executed with the same efficiency that had characterized previous royal purges. His fall demonstrated that even the most powerful royal servants were expendable when they failed to satisfy the king's needs. The speed of these changes was dizzying. Within weeks, Henry had eliminated his unwanted wife, destroyed the minister responsible for the marriage, and begun pursuing his next romantic interest. The court adapted to these transformations with the weary efficiency of people who had witnessed similar upheavals before. For you personally, the Cleves crisis provided important lessons about court survival. Your careful neutrality during the political maneuvering had protected you from association with any of the failed parties. Your focus on musical competence, rather than political positioning, had allowed you to continue serving regardless of who was in favor or out of favor. But the crisis also highlighted the essential randomness of court life. Cromwell's destruction, despite years of faithful service and exceptional ability, reminded everyone that royal favor was temporary and that survival often depended more on luck than merit. The summer of 1540 brought news that the king was already pursuing his fifth wife. Catherine Howard, a young woman from a prominent noble family, had captured Henry's attention with her beauty and vivacious personality. The prospect of another royal marriage so soon after the Cleves debacle created new anxieties about what changes might be coming to court life. Your position heading into this next transition was stronger than it had been during previous royal marriages. Your proven adaptability, growing reputation as a composer, and careful political neutrality had established you as a valuable and reliable member of the musical household. Whatever changes Catherine Howard might bring to court culture, you felt reasonably confident about your ability to adapt successfully. Catherine Howard's elevation to queen in the summer of 1540 brought a dramatic transformation to court atmosphere. At perhaps 19 years old, she was young enough to be Henry's daughter, and her youth and energy created a renaissance of courtly pleasure that had been absent since the early days of the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. The new queen's musical preferences reflected her personality and generation. She favored lively dance music over serious compositions, popular songs over learned polyphony, and entertainments that emphasized participation over passive listening. Her court became known for its elaborate balls, masques, and festivals that required constant musical accompaniment. For you and the other court musicians, Catherine's reign meant busier schedules, but also more opportunities for creative expression. The Queen's enthusiasm for entertainment created demand for new compositions, innovative arrangements, and experimental musical forms that had been discouraged during more conservative periods. Your skills as a composer found new outlets in the dance music that Catherine particularly enjoyed. You created several galliards and pavans that became popular at court, and your ability to arrange existing melodies for dancing made you increasingly valuable to the royal household. The king's own behavior changed dramatically under Catherine's influence. Henry, now approaching 50 and struggling with increasing health problems, seemed rejuvenated by his young wife's attention. His appetite for entertainment expanded, and his willingness to participate in musical activities increased notably. One memorable evening in the autumn of 1540, the king called for an impromptu musical competition among the court musicians. Each performer was required to improvise variations on a popular tune, with the king himself serving as judge. The informal atmosphere was unlike anything you had experienced during previous reigns. When your turn came, You chose to improvise on a melody that Catherine had mentioned enjoying. Your variations were technically accomplished, but also accessible and entertaining, striking the balance that seemed to define successful court music under the new regime. The king's response was enthusiastic. "Excellent work, Master Cornish. You have captured the spirit of the melody while demonstrating your own skills. Such adaptability is precisely what we value in our musical household." Catherine's approval was equally satisfying. She clapped enthusiastically and requested that you teach the arrangement to other musicians so it could be performed at future gatherings. Her genuine appreciation for music made performing for her more enjoyable than the careful political calculations that had characterized entertainment for previous queens. But even as you enjoyed this more relaxed court atmosphere, you remained aware that Catherine's youth and inexperience might create their own dangers. She lacked the political sophistication that had helped previous queens navigate court intrigues, and her family background included connections that might prove problematic if examined too closely. These concerns proved prophetic by early 1541. Rumors were beginning to circulate about Catherine's behavior, both before and after her marriage to the king. Stories emerged about romantic relationships during her adolescence, and whispers suggested that she might be continuing inappropriate relationships even as queen. The musical household tried to maintain normal routines while these rumors circulated, but the increasingly tense atmosphere made everyone nervous. The memory of Anne Boleyn's fall was still fresh, and the parallels between the two situations were uncomfortably obvious. Catherine's own behavior during this period showed increasing signs of stress and poor judgment. She became more demanding in her requirements for entertainment, more critical of musical performances, and more prone to emotional outbursts that made serving her household increasingly difficult. The crisis broke in November 1541 when formal accusations were made against the queen. She was charged with adultery with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, and with concealing previous relationships that should have been disclosed before her marriage. The king's reaction was explosive. Henry's rage exceeded even his fury during Anne Boleyn's fall, perhaps because Catherine's youth had made him feel particularly vulnerable and foolish. The entire court went into lockdown as investigations began, and arrests were made for court musicians. Catherine's fall created familiar dangers. Anyone associated with her household was potentially suspect, and the music that had been created for her entertainment might now be seen as evidence of inappropriate relationships with the royal family. You found yourself reviewing every interaction you had had with the queen, every composition you had created for her entertainment, every conversation that might be misconstrued as evidence of disloyalty or inappropriate behavior. The paranoia was overwhelming but necessary. In such circumstances, survival often depended on being able to demonstrate complete innocence of any wrongdoing. Thomas Tallis, now in his late 40s and a veteran of multiple royal crises, provided crucial guidance during this dangerous period. "Distance yourself from anything connected to the queen," he advised. "Destroy any personal communications. Avoid discussing her with anyone, and focus entirely on your musical duties. The storm will pass, but only if you avoid being caught in it." Catherine Howard's execution on February 13, 1542, marked the end of another chapter in the increasingly dark story of Henry VIII's marriages. The young woman who had brought such energy and joy to court life died for crimes that may have been as much products of political necessity as actual guilt. The aftermath of Catherine's fall was familiar, but no less devastating for its predictability. Her household was dissolved, her supporters were imprisoned or executed, and anyone associated with her regime found themselves under suspicion. The court returned to the careful, fearful atmosphere that had characterized previous periods of royal crisis. For you personally, Catherine's destruction served as another reminder of the fundamental vulnerability of everyone who served the Tudor court. No amount of talent, loyalty, or good service could provide complete protection against the randomness of royal displeasure and political change. The musical household survived the crisis with minimal casualties, partly because most musicians had been careful to maintain professional distance from the Queen's more personal activities. But the psychological toll was significant. Watching another talented, vibrant young woman destroyed by the machinery of court politics left lasting scars on everyone who witnessed it. Henry's own transformation following Catherine's execution was profound and disturbing. The king became increasingly suspicious, isolated, and prone to violent outbursts that made serving him dangerous and unpredictable. His health was deteriorating, his temper was shortening, and his capacity for mercy was virtually non-existent. The musical requirements of this new, darker court atmosphere were challenging to navigate. The king still required entertainment, but his preferences had shifted toward more serious, contemplative pieces that reflected his aging and the accumulating weight of his reign. The joyful dance music that had characterized Catherine's era was replaced by solemn compositions that acknowledged the reality of mortality and judgment. Your own compositional work during this period reflected these darker themes. You created several pieces based on penitential texts that seemed to capture the king's evolving spiritual and emotional state. The technical demands of these compositions were significant, but they also provided opportunities to explore more sophisticated musical ideas than had been possible during the lighter entertainment periods. One such composition was a setting of the Miserere Mei Dies that incorporated some of the most advanced polyphonic techniques you had mastered. The piece was designed for performance during Lent, when the court's musical requirements allowed. For longer, more serious works that reflected the season's themes of repentance and spiritual preparation. The premiere of this composition took place in the Royal Chapel during Holy Week 1542. The performance was successful both musically and politically. The king expressed satisfaction with your work, and the piece seemed to provide the kind of serious musical reflection that suited his current temperament. Master Cornish, the king, commented after the service, "Your music has grown in depth and seriousness as your service has continued." Such development is evidence of a mind that understands the weight of responsibility and the importance of using one's talents in service to higher purposes. This royal approval was gratifying, but it also highlighted how much you had changed. During your years at court, the ambitious young musician who had arrived at Greenwich Palace in 1536 had been transformed by 6 years of court service into someone who understood survival as much as musical excellence. The transformation wasn't entirely positive. The constant vigilance required for court survival had made spontaneous creativity more difficult. The need to read political currents had made pure artistic expression more complex. The experience of witnessing so much human destruction had made emotional investment in court relationships more dangerous. But there were also positive aspects to this evolution. Your musical skills had advanced far beyond what you could have achieved in any other environment. Your understanding of composition, performance, and the relationship between music and power had deepened in ways that made you a more sophisticated artist. Your survival of multiple court crises had given you confidence and wisdom that would serve you well regardless of future circumstances. Thomas Tallis, observing your development with the satisfaction of a successful mentor, offered his assessment during one of your private conversations. "You have learned the essential lesson of court service," he said. "Excellence alone is not enough. It must be combined with prudence, adaptability, and the wisdom to understand that individual survival and artistic achievement are not contradictory goals." By the summer of 1542, the court was beginning to speculate about whether the king would attempt a sixth marriage. Henry was now 51 years old, increasingly infirm, and facing the challenge of securing his dynasty with only one legitimate heir. The possibility of another royal marriage created familiar anxieties about what changes might be coming to court life. Your position heading into whatever transitions might lie ahead was more secure than ever before. Your demonstrated ability to adapt to changing circumstances, your growing reputation as a serious composer, and your careful navigation of multiple political crises had established you as an indispensable member of the royal musical establishment. More importantly, you had developed the psychological tools necessary for long-term court survival. The naive young musician who had been terrified by a broken lute string in 1536 had evolved into someone who understood that court service was fundamentally about managing risk rather than avoiding it entirely. Henry's sixth and final marriage to Catherine Parr in July 1543 brought yet another transformation to court culture, though this one would prove more stable and enduring than its predecessors. Catherine was 31 years old, a widow with substantial experience managing households and estates, and a woman of genuine intellectual accomplishments who brought scholarly interests to her role as queen. The new queen's musical preferences reflected her education and sophisticated tastes. She favored complex polyphonic compositions over simple entertainment music, and she was particularly interested in the relationship between musical and literary texts. Her patronage encouraged the development of more ambitious musical works that combined technical innovation with intellectual substance. For you and the musical household, Catherine's reign created opportunities to explore the kind of serious, compositional work that had been discouraged during the more frivolous periods of previous reigns. The Queen actively commissioned new works, participated in musical discussions, and demonstrated the kind of informed appreciation that made creating music for her both challenging and rewarding. Your first major composition for Queen Catherine was a setting of a psalm text that she had specifically requested. The piece required sophisticated polyphonic writing that could support extended textual development while maintaining musical coherence and interest. The challenge was exactly the kind of serious musical problem that you had been hoping to tackle for years. Working on this composition allowed you to draw upon all the technical skills you had developed during your court service while exploring musical ideas that had been too risky to attempt during more politically volatile periods. The result was a piece that represented your most mature musical thinking to that point in your career. The premiere took place during a private concert in the Queen's apartments, with an audience that included several learned courtiers who were capable of appreciating the work's technical sophistication. The performance was successful both musically and socially, establishing your reputation as a composer capable of serious artistic achievement. Queen Catherine's response was particularly gratifying. She engaged you in a detailed discussion about the relationship between musical and textual structure, demonstrating an understanding of compositional techniques that exceeded that of most courtiers. Her genuine intellectual curiosity made serving her household a pleasure rather than simply a professional obligation. The king's own musical activities during this period seemed to be influenced by Catherine's more serious approach to artistic life. Henry continued to compose occasionally, but his works show greater ambition and sophistication than his earlier pieces. His health problems were becoming more severe, but his mental faculties remained sharp, and his interest in music as an intellectual exercise appeared to be increasing. The court atmosphere under Catherine's influence was notably more stable and scholarly than it had been during previous reigns. The Queen's mature judgment and political experience helped create an environment where long-term artistic projects could be undertaken without constant fear of sudden political upheavals. This stability allowed you to develop more ambitious compositional plans. You began working on a cycle of pieces based on the church calendar that would demonstrate your mastery of various sacred musical forms while providing practical liturgical music for court use. The project represented the kind of sustained artistic effort that had been impossible during more turbulent periods. The musical household itself benefited from the more settled court atmosphere. Relationships among musicians became more collaborative and less competitive as the reduced political pressure made survival seem less dependent on eliminating rivals. Thomas Tallis, now in his early 50s, used this period to mentor younger musicians and to develop some of his most sophisticated compositions. Your own role within the musical establishment had evolved significantly by this point. No longer simply a performer who occasionally composed pieces for specific occasions. You had become recognized as one of the court's principal composers, with regular commissions and the kind of artistic respect that you had dreamed of achieving when you first arrived at court. The development of your reputation had practical as well as artistic benefits. Your increased status brought better accommodations, higher wages, and the kind of social recognition that made court life more comfortable and secure. More importantly, your established position made you less vulnerable to the political changes that continued to affect other court servants. You developed several pieces specifically designed for occasions when Prince Edward was present. These compositions were melodically appealing and structurally clear, but they incorporated educational elements that could help develop the young prince's musical understanding. The pieces became popular throughout the court and were frequently requested for family gatherings. Queen Catherine's role during this period was increasingly important as she took on more responsibilities for managing court affairs while the king's health declined. Her continued patronage of music and learning helped maintain the intellectual atmosphere that had characterized her reign. Even as political pressures intensified around questions of succession and religious policy, the Queen's musical preferences during this period seemed to reflect her awareness of the transitional nature of the times. She commissioned several pieces that celebrated English musical traditions while incorporating innovations that might appeal to the next generation of royal patrons. These works served as bridges between the musical culture of Henry's reign and whatever might develop under Prince Edward's future rule. Your position within this evolving court structure was more secure than that of many courtiers. Musicians were generally considered politically neutral, and your long service record and proven adaptability made you valuable regardless of what changes might come with a new reign. But the uncertainty about the future created psychological pressures that affected everyone at court. Thomas Tallis, now in his mid-50s and approaching the end of his own career, served as a stabilizing influence during this difficult period. His decades of court experience provided perspective on the current crisis that helped younger musicians understand their situation within the broader patterns of royal service. Kings die, he observed during one of your conversations, but music endures. Our job is to serve the crown faithfully while preserving the artistic traditions that will outlive any individual monarch. The pieces you create today may be performed. For Prince Edward's children and grandchildren, this long-term perspective was both comforting and challenging. It suggested that your current work had significance beyond immediate political circumstances, but it also emphasized the responsibility to create music worthy of such extended survival. The final months of Henry's life were marked by increasing isolation and paranoia. The king trusted fewer people, required more elaborate security arrangements, and became more suspicious of any behavior that might be construed as preparation for his death. For court musicians, this meant walking an even finer line between acknowledging reality and maintaining the fiction that the king's health was not in serious decline. Your own relationship with the dying king during this period was complex and emotionally charged. Henry still appreciated your musical services and occasionally engaged in conversations about composition and performance. But his physical deterioration was painful to witness, and his awareness of his approaching death created an atmosphere of desperate sadness that affected everyone around him. The music you created during these final months reflected this atmosphere. of impending loss and uncertain transition. The pieces were technically accomplished and emotionally powerful, but they carried an undercurrent of mourning that seemed to anticipate the end of an era rather than simply providing entertainment for current circumstances. King Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, in the early morning hours at Whitehall Palace. His death, while long anticipated, sent shock waves through the court that affected every aspect of royal life. The transition from Henry's absolute personal rule to a regency government ruling in the name of 9-year-old King Edward VI created uncertainties that would reshape English society and culture for decades to come. For the musical household, Henry's death marked the end of a reign that had profoundly shaped English musical development. The king's personal interest in music, his patronage of composers and performers, and his own compositional activities had created an environment where musical arts flourished despite the political turmoil that characterized much of his reign. Your own position during this transition was both secure and uncertain. As an established court musician with nearly 11 years of service, you were likely to continue under the new regime, but Prince Edward's youth meant that real power would be exercised by regents and counselors whose musical preferences and priorities were unknown quantities. The funeral arrangements for Henry VIII required extensive musical preparation. The king's death had to be marked with ceremonies appropriate to his status as one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, while also acknowledging the religious changes that had occurred during his reign. The musical requirements were both traditional and innovative, honoring established protocols while reflecting England's break with Catholic practices. You were asked to contribute to the musical planning for the funeral, working with Thomas Tallis and other senior musicians to create a program that would serve both ceremonial and emotional needs. The challenge was creating music that could honor Henry's memory while remaining appropriate for Protestant liturgical requirements. The composition you created for the funeral was a setting of Psalm 130, De Profundis, that drew upon the most sophisticated polyphonic techniques you had mastered while maintaining the clarity and directness that characterized Reformed religious music. The piece was both a tribute to the dead king and a prayer for divine mercy that seemed particularly appropriate given Henry's complex legacy. The funeral itself was one of the most elaborate ceremonies you had ever participated in. The musical elements were performed flawlessly, but the emotional atmosphere was complex and difficult to navigate. Henry had been feared as much as respected, and his death created relief as well as genuine mourning among those who had served him. Young King Edward VI's coronation followed in February, bringing new challenges and opportunities for the musical household. The 9-year-old king was intelligent and well-educated, but his musical tastes were still developing, and the real decisions about court entertainment would be made by his regents and counselors. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, emerged as the dominant figure in the regency government. His religious views were strongly Protestant, and his cultural preferences favored the kind of simplified, direct musical styles that supported Reformed liturgical practices. This meant significant changes in the kinds of music that would be valued at court. For you personally, these changes required another major adaptation to new circumstances. The complex polyphonic compositions that had pleased Henry VIII were less valued by the new regime, which preferred music that supported congregational singing and Protestant theological emphases. Your compositional skills had to be redirected toward different musical goals. The challenge was maintaining artistic integrity while adapting to these new requirements. Protestant musical styles could be sophisticated and beautiful, but they operated according to different principles than the Catholic-influenced polyphony that had dominated earlier court music. Learning to create excellent music within these new constraints required both technical skill and philosophical adjustment. Your first major composition for the new reign was a setting of an English psalm texts that incorporated the melodic clarity and harmonic directness that characterized Protestant musical ideals. The piece was successful both artistically and politically, demonstrating your ability to create meaningful music within the new cultural framework. King Edward's own musical education was entrusted to several tutors who emphasized both practical skills and theoretical understanding. As an established court musician, you were occasionally called upon to assist with the young king's musical instruction, providing opportunities to observe his developing tastes and abilities. Edward was a quick learner with genuine musical ability. His preferences leaned toward the clearer, more direct musical styles that his tutors encouraged. But he also showed appreciation for technical sophistication when it served clear artistic purposes. Working with him provided insights into the direction that English court music might take during his reign. Queen Catherine Parr continued to play an important role in court life during the early months of Edward's reign. Her scholarly interests and mature judgment made her a valuable advisor to the Regency government, and her continued patronage of learning and music helped maintain cultural continuity during the transition. Your relationship with the Dowager Queen during this period was particularly important. She continued to commission musical works and to support the kind of serious artistic projects that had characterized her reign as Henry's wife. Her patronage provided stability and artistic purpose during a time when many court traditions were being questioned or abandoned. Thomas Tallis, now approaching 60 and the senior member of the musical household, played a crucial role in helping the court adapt to its new circumstances. His vast experience and diplomatic skills made him invaluable in navigating the cultural changes that accompanied the new reign. His example provided a model for how established musicians could maintain their positions while adapting to new requirements. Henry VI's and final marriage to Catherine Parr in July 1543 brought yet another transformation to court culture, though this one would prove more stable and enduring than its predecessors. Catherine was 31 years old, a widow with substantial experience managing households and estates, and a woman of genuine intellectual accomplishments who brought scholarly interests to her role as queen. The new queen's musical preferences reflected her education and sophisticated tastes. She favored complex polyphonic compositions over simple entertainment music, and she was particularly interested in the relationship between musical and literary texts. Her patronage encouraged the development of more ambitious musical works that combined technical innovation with intellectual substance. For you and the musical household, Catherine's reign created opportunities to explore the kind of serious compositional work that had been discouraged during the more frivolous periods of previous reigns. The Queen actively commissioned new works, participated in musical discussions, and demonstrated the kind of informed appreciation that made creating music for her both challenging and rewarding. Your first major composition for Queen Catherine was a setting of a psalm text that she had specifically requested. The piece required sophisticated polyphonic writing that could support extended textual development while maintaining musical coherence and interest. The challenge was exactly the kind of serious musical problem that you had been hoping to tackle for years. Working on this composition allowed you to draw upon all the technical skills you had developed during your court service while exploring musical ideas that had been too risky to attempt during more politically volatile periods. The result was a piece that represented your most mature musical thinking to that point in your career. The premiere took place during a private concert in the Queen's apartments, with an audience that included several learned courtiers who were capable of appreciating the work's technical sophistication. The performance was successful both musically and socially, establishing your reputation as a composer capable of serious artistic achievement. Queen Catherine's response was particularly gratifying. She engaged you in a detailed discussion about the relationship between musical and textual structure, demonstrating an understanding of compositional techniques that exceeded that of most courtiers. Her genuine intellectual curiosity made serving her household a pleasure rather than simply a professional obligation. The king's own musical activities during this period seemed to be influenced by Catherine's more serious approach to artistic life. Henry continued to compose occasionally, but his works showed greater ambition and sophistication than his earlier pieces. His health problems were becoming more severe, but his mental faculties remained sharp, and his interest in music as an intellectual exercise appeared to be increasing. The court atmosphere under Catherine's influence was notably more stable and scholarly than it had been during previous reigns. The Queen's mature judgment and political experience helped create an environment where long-term artistic projects could be undertaken without constant fear of sudden political upheavals. This stability allowed you to develop more ambitious compositional plans. You began working on a cycle of pieces based on the church calendar that would demonstrate your mastery of various sacred musical forms while providing practical liturgical music for court use. The project represented the kind of sustained artistic effort that had been impossible during more turbulent periods. The musical household itself benefited from the more settled court atmosphere. Relationships among musicians became more collaborative and less competitive as the reduced political pressure made survival seem less dependent on eliminating rivals. Thomas Tallis, now in his early 50s, used this period to mentor younger musicians and to develop some of his most sophisticated compositions. Your own role within the musical establishment had evolved significantly by this point. No longer simply a performer who occasionally composed pieces for specific occasions, you had become recognized as one of the court's principal composers, with regular commissions and the kind of artistic respect that you had dreamed of achieving when you first arrived at court. The development of your reputation had practical as well as artistic benefits. Your increased status brought better accommodations, higher wages, and the kind of social recognition that made court life more comfortable and secure. More importantly, your established position made you less vulnerable to the political changes that continued to affect other court servants. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. The constant fear that had characterized your early years of court service had been replaced by a more mature understanding of court dynamics and your place within them. You had learned to function effectively within the system without losing your essential humanity or artistic integrity. Queen Catherine's scholarly interests also created opportunities for collaboration with other learned members of the court. You worked with several poets and scholars on musical settings of their texts, creating works that combined literary and musical sophistication in ways that pleased both the Queen and the broader court audience. One such collaboration was with John Leland, the court's principal antiquarian and scholar. Leland had written a series of Latin poems celebrating various aspects of English history and culture, and the Queen commissioned you to create musical settings that would make these texts accessible to court audiences through performance. The resulting compositions were among your most successful works, combining historical themes that appealed to English patriotic sentiment with musical techniques that demonstrated your compositional maturity. The pieces became popular throughout the court and were frequently requested for various ceremonial occasions. By 1544, you had achieved a level of artistic and professional success that exceeded your most ambitious early expectations. Your compositions were regularly performed, your services were valued by both the king and queen, and your position within the court hierarchy was secure and respected. The journey from the nervous young musician who had auditioned before Henry VIII in 1536 to the established court composer of 1544 had been transformative in ways that went far beyond professional advancement. You had learned to navigate complex political environments, adapt to changing circumstances, and create meaningful artistic work within challenging constraints. By 1545, King Henry VIII was clearly a dying man, though few at court dared to acknowledge this reality openly. His health had been deteriorating for years, but the pace of decline was accelerating in ways that affected every aspect of court life. The king's increasing physical limitations and unpredictable moods created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that made serving him both more important and more dangerous than ever. The musical requirements of this final period of Henry's reign were complex and emotionally charged. The king still demanded entertainment, but his preferences had shifted almost entirely towards serious, contemplative music that reflected his awareness of mortality. The joyful compositions that had characterized earlier periods of his reign were replaced by pieces that dealt with themes of judgment, redemption, and eternal life. Your own compositional work during this period was heavily influenced by these darker themes. You created several pieces based on texts about death and dying that seemed to capture the king's evolving spiritual preoccupations. The technical demands of these compositions were significant, but they also provided opportunities to explore the most profound questions that music could address. One such composition was a setting of the Dies Irae that incorporated some of the most sophisticated polyphonic techniques available to English composers. The piece was designed for performance during funeral services, when the court's musical requirements allowed for extended meditation on mortality and divine judgment. The challenge of setting such a text was both musical and psychological. The Dies Irae dealt with themes of final judgment and eternal damnation that were particularly relevant to a king who had executed numerous wives, ministers, and subjects during his reign. Creating music that honestly addressed these themes while remaining politically acceptable required exceptional sensitivity and skill. The premiere of this composition took place during a memorial service for one of the king's longtime courtiers. The performance was emotionally powerful and technically successful, but the king's response was complex and difficult to interpret. He expressed satisfaction with the musical craftsmanship, but his emotional reaction suggested that the piece had touched on personal fears and guilt that he preferred not to examine too closely. The final years of Henry's reign also brought increased attention to the succession question and the future of the court under Prince Edward's eventual rule. The young prince was now 7 years old, beginning his formal education and occasionally appearing at court functions where musicians were required to provide appropriate entertainment. Performing for Prince Edward required different skills than entertaining his father. The boy was intelligent and well-educated, but his musical tastes were still forming, and his attention span was limited. Creating music that could engage a child while remaining sophisticated enough for adult audiences was a unique challenge. The first year of Edward VI's reign was marked by careful experimentation as the Regency government worked to establish new patterns of court life that would serve the young king's needs while maintaining royal dignity and authority. For musicians, this meant opportunities to explore new musical forms and styles while preserving the essential functions that music served in royal ceremonies and entertainment. Your own development during this transitional period reflected the broader changes affecting English musical culture. The skills you had developed during Henry's reign provided a foundation for adaptation to new circumstances, but success required willingness to learn new techniques and to embrace different aesthetic principles. The early years of Edward VI's reign proved that your decade of service under Henry VIII had prepared you well for the challenges of musical adaptation. By 1548, you had successfully navigated the transition from Catholic-influenced polyphony to Protestant musical simplicity, demonstrating once again your ability to serve changing royal needs while maintaining artistic integrity. The young king's musical education continued to progress under your occasional guidance and that of other court musicians. Edward showed genuine talent and increasingly sophisticated understanding of musical structure and composition. His preferences were shaping the direction of court music in ways that blended traditional English elements with the reformed religious principles that guided his education. Your position within the court hierarchy had stabilized at a level that provided both security and opportunities for continued artistic development. As one of the senior composers in the royal musical establishment, you were regularly called upon to create music for important ceremonies and to contribute to the ongoing evolution of English musical style. The composition you created for Edward's 10th birthday celebration exemplified this evolution. The piece combined melodic accessibility with harmonic sophistication, creating music that could appeal to both the young king and the adult courtiers who surrounded him. The work was successful enough to be performed repeatedly throughout the year. Thomas Tallis, now in his early 60s, had achieved the status of elder statesman within the musical household. His continued productivity and his role as mentor to younger musicians made him invaluable to the court's cultural life. His example provided a model for how a career in royal service could extend across multiple reigns while maintaining artistic relevance. The broader cultural changes occurring during Edward's reign affected every aspect of court life, including music. The Protestant Reformation was accelerating, with implications for liturgical music, ceremonial requirements, and the philosophical principles that guided artistic creation. Adapting to these changes required not just technical skill, but also intellectual and spiritual flexibility. Your own compositions during this period reflected your engagement with these broader cultural transformations. The music you created combined traditional English musical strengths with the clarity and directness that characterized reformed religious expression. The result was a body of work that served immediate practical needs while contributing to the long-term development of English musical culture. The Regency government's approach to court entertainment emphasized education and moral instruction, along with traditional pleasure and ceremony. This created opportunities for musicians to explore the relationship between music and learning, developing compositions that could serve both artistic and pedagogical purposes. One such project was a series of musical settings of classical texts that were being used in the young king's education. The compositions were designed to make these texts more memorable and engaging while demonstrating the relationship between musical and literary structure. The project was successful enough to influence other educational initiatives at court. Queen Catherine Parr's continued presence at court provided stability and cultural continuity during these years of change. Her scholarly interests and patronage of learning created opportunities for serious artistic work that might otherwise have been discouraged by the emphasis on simplicity and directness that characterized Protestant musical ideals. Your relationship with the Dowager Queen during this period was particularly productive. She commissioned several major compositions that allowed you to explore sophisticated musical ideas within frameworks that satisfied reformed religious requirements. These works represented some of your most mature artistic achievements. The death of Catherine Parr in September 1548 marked the end of an era for the court's intellectual and cultural life. She had been the last direct link to Henry VIII's reign and had provided crucial support for the kind of learned, musical activity that distinguished court culture from simpler forms of entertainment. The loss of Catherine's patronage required you to develop new relationships with other supporters of serious musical work. Fortunately, several members of the Regency government and noble courtiers shared her appreciation for sophisticated artistic achievement, providing alternative sources of support for ambitious musical projects. By 1549, you had achieved a level of artistic maturity and professional security that allowed you to pursue longer-term musical goals. The various adaptations you had made during your 13 years of court service had developed your compositional skills while teaching you how to create meaningful music within changing political and cultural constraints. The musical household itself had evolved into a more collaborative and less hierarchical organization than it had been during Henry's reign. The reduced emphasis on personal royal favor and the increased importance of institutional stability had created an environment where musicians could focus more on artistic excellence and less on political survival. Your own role within this evolved musical establishment was that of a senior composer, an occasional mentor to younger musicians. The experience you had gained in navigating court politics and adapting to changing circumstances made you a valuable advisor to newcomers who were learning the complex skills required for royal service. Thomas Tallis's example continued to inspire your own approach to long-term career development. His ability to remain artistically productive and professionally relevant across multiple reigns demonstrated that survival in court service required not just adaptability but also commitment to the fundamental values that made music valuable to royal patrons. The perspective that came with successful survival of multiple court transitions allowed you to see your individual career within the broader context of English musical development. The compositions you had created, the traditions you had preserved and adapted, and the younger musicians you had influenced were all part of a cultural continuum that extended far beyond any individual reign or personal achievement. This broader perspective was both humbling and empowering. It reminded you that your individual contributions were small parts of a larger artistic tradition, but it also suggested that thoughtful, skillful service could have lasting impact on cultural development that would extend far beyond your own lifetime. By 1550, you had achieved the kind of artistic mastery and professional status that you could only have dreamed of when you first auditioned before Henry VIII 14 years earlier. Your compositions were regularly performed throughout the court. Your musical judgment was sought by both colleagues and superiors, and your position within the royal establishment was secure and respected. The young King Edward, now 13 years old, had developed into an intelligent and sophisticated patron of music whose tastes reflected both his excellent education and his own artistic sensibilities. His preferences continued to favor the clear, direct musical styles that characterized Protestant culture, but his growing maturity allowed him to appreciate technical sophistication when it served meaningful artistic purposes. Your relationship with the teenage king had evolved from that of an instructor providing occasional musical education to something approaching artistic collaboration. Edward occasionally requested specific types of compositions and engaged in detailed discussions about musical technique and theory that demonstrated his genuine understanding of the art form. The composition you created for Edward's 13th birthday was among your most successful works, combining technical accomplishment with the kind of melodic appeal that made music accessible to broad audiences. The piece was performed at the birthday celebration and subsequently became one of the most frequently requested works in your catalog. Thomas Tallis, now in his mid-60s, had achieved legendary status within the musical establishment. His continued productivity, his role as mentor to multiple generations of younger musicians, and his remarkable survival across 3 reigns had made him the most respected musical figure at court. His example provided inspiration for your own aspirations for long-term artistic development. The musical household under Edward's reign had developed into a sophisticated organization that balanced individual artistic achievement with collaborative musical projects. The reduced political pressure that characterized the young king's court allowed musicians to focus more on artistic excellence and less on the survival strategies that had been necessary during more turbulent periods. Mary Tudor's death on November 17, 1558, marked the end of a reign that had attempted to reverse England's Protestant Reformation and restore Catholic religious and cultural traditions. Her death also began your final major career transition, as 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor's accession promised another dramatic shift in court culture and musical requirements. For you personally, Mary's death represented the loss of a patron who had appreciated and rewarded your ability to create sophisticated Catholic music that served both liturgical and artistic purposes. The 5 years of her reign had provided opportunities to revive and develop compositional skills that connected your work to the broader European tradition of Catholic musical excellence. Elizabeth I's personality and cultural preferences were already well known at court, suggesting that her reign would bring yet another transformation in royal musical requirements. Her Protestant religious convictions, combined with her exceptional education and sophisticated artistic tastes, indicated that court music would need to evolve in directions that balanced reformed religious principles with intellectual and aesthetic sophistication. By 1560, you had achieved something that few court musicians could claim: a career spanning nearly a quarter century and 5 different monarchs, each with distinct musical preferences and cultural requirements. Your survival and artistic development through this period of unprecedented religious and political change represented both personal achievement and contribution to the broader evolution of English musical culture. The young man who had nervously auditioned before Henry VIII in 1536 had been transformed by decades of court service into one of England's most respected composers and musical figures. The journey from ambitious newcomer to established master had required not just artistic development but also the cultivation of diplomatic skills, cultural adaptability, and psychological resilience that allowed survival in one of Europe's most dangerous courts. Your compositional catalog by this point included works that served multiple religious traditions, various ceremonial functions, and diverse aesthetic purposes. The music you had created reflected the complex cultural evolution that had characterized Tudor England, while demonstrating how individual artistic vision could find expression within changing political and religious constraints. The relationship between survival and artistic achievement that had defined your career provided important lessons about the nature of creative work under authoritarian political systems. Your experience demonstrated that adaptation to changing circumstances didn't necessarily require compromise of artistic integrity, but it did demand sophisticated understanding of how cultural and political forces shaped the context within which artistic work was created and received. Thomas Tallis, now in his early 80s and approaching the end of his own legendary career, had become something like a father figure whose example continued to inspire your approach to musical life. His ability to maintain artistic productivity and institutional respect across 6 decades of court service provided a model for how individual careers could contribute to larger cultural developments. The musical household under Elizabeth I had evolved into one of Europe's most sophisticated court musical establishments. The combination of royal patronage, institutional stability, and artistic excellence that characterized Elizabethan court music influenced musical development throughout England and contributed to the kingdom's growing cultural prestige among European nations. Your own role within this musical establishment was that of a senior composer and informal advisor whose experience with multiple royal transitions made you a valuable resource for younger musicians who were still learning to navigate court life. The mentoring relationships you had developed provided opportunities to share the wisdom you had gained while contributing to the continued development of English musical culture. The broader perspective that came with surviving multiple political and religious transitions allowed you to see your individual career within the context of historical forces that were larger than personal achievement. The music you had created, the traditions you had preserved and adapted, and the younger musicians you had influenced were all part of a cultural evolution that extended far beyond any individual contribution. This historical perspective was both humbling and empowering. It reminded you that individual artistic achievement was meaningful primarily insofar as it contributed to larger cultural developments, but it also suggested that thoughtful, skillful work could have lasting impact that extended far beyond personal career considerations. The psychological costs of court survival had been significant and lasting. The constant vigilance required for political navigation, the emotional toll of witnessing multiple court purges and executions, and the necessity of suppressing personal convictions in service of professional survival had left marks that would never completely heal. But the artistic rewards had been substantial and fulfilling. The opportunity to create sophisticated music for sophisticated audiences, the privilege of working with exceptional musical colleagues, and the satisfaction of contributing to cultural developments that would influence future generations of English musicians provided compensation for the personal sacrifices that court service had required. The compositions you had created during your court career represented more than professional achievement. They were documents of a remarkable period in English cultural history that had seen dramatic religious transformations, political upheavals, and artistic innovations that reshaped the kingdom's cultural identity. Your settings of liturgical texts reflected the complex religious evolution that had characterized Tudor England, while your ceremonial compositions documented the changing nature of royal power and cultural expression. The secular pieces you had created for court entertainment preserved elements of English musical tradition while incorporating innovations that kept pace with European developments. The influence of your work extended beyond immediate court applications to affect musical practices in noble households, religious institutions, and community organizations throughout England. The stylistic innovations you had contributed to, and the compositional techniques you had developed, were being adopted by musicians across the kingdom who sought to emulate the sophisticated musical culture of Elizabeth's court. The legacy you were creating through your compositions and your influence on younger musicians represented a form of immortality that transcended individual career considerations. The musical ideas you had developed and the artistic standards you had maintained would continue to influence English musical culture long after your own career had ended. This sense of contributing to something larger than personal achievement provided deep satisfaction that compensated for many of the difficulties and sacrifices that court service had required. The knowledge that your work would outlive your own life and continue to influence future generations of musicians gave meaning to the struggles and adaptations that had characterized your career. As you approached what might be the final phase of your court service, the perspective that came with surviving multiple royal transitions and contributing to significant cultural developments allowed you to see your individual story within the broader narrative of English musical evolution during one of its most dynamic and transformative periods. As the candles flicker low in your chamber at Greenwich Palace on this winter evening in 1560, you set down your quill and review the composition you have just completed, a delicate motet for Queen Elizabeth's upcoming birthday celebration. Outside your window, the Thames flows dark and silent toward London, carrying with it the memories of all the monarchs, queens, courtiers, and fellow musicians who've passed through your life during these remarkable 24 years of service. The broken lute string that had terrified you during that performance for Henry VIII in 1536 seems like a lifetime ago. That young man who trembled before the mercurial king could never have imagined the journey that lay ahead, the royal marriages and divorces, the executions and ascensions, the religious transformations and political upheavals that would test every skill, every instinct, every moral choice that defines a human being. You have survived what few others could. The reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and now Elizabeth I. You have watched friends and colleagues destroyed by political changes beyond their control, while somehow managing to adapt your art and your allegiances to serve four dramatically different visions of English monarchy. Mark Smeaton's execution still haunts your dreams, a reminder of how quickly court favor can turn to death sentence. How thin the line between survival and destruction truly is. The succession crisis that followed, Edward's death brought the kind of political upheaval that had characterized earlier periods of court life. Lady Jane Grey's brief reign was followed by the triumph of Mary Tudor, whose Catholic sympathies and political priorities would inevitably bring major changes to court culture and musical life. Your preparation for serving under Mary Tudor drew upon all the experience you had gained in adapting to changing royal preferences during your nearly 2 decades of court service. The skills that had allowed you to survive transitions from Henry VII's complex requirements through Edward VI's Protestant simplicity would be tested once again as England returned to Catholic religious practices. The musical implications of Mary's accession were significant and challenging. The Protestant musical styles that had flourished during Edward's reign would need to be replaced or supplemented with compositions that served Catholic liturgical requirements. Your own compositional skills would need to be redirected toward musical forms and techniques that you had not explored for nearly a decade. But the challenge was also an opportunity. Your early experience with Catholic musical traditions, combined with the technical skills you had developed during years of Protestant musical composition, positioned you to contribute to what might become a renaissance of Catholic musical culture in England. Thomas Tallis's example continued to provide inspiration and guidance during this latest transition. His remarkable ability to adapt to changing religious and political requirements, while maintaining artistic integrity and professional respect, demonstrated that survival and artistic achievement were compatible goals even under the most challenging circumstances. Mary Tudor's accession to the throne in July 1553 brought the most dramatic religious and cultural reversal of your court career. After 6 years of Protestant rule under Edward VI, England was returning to Catholic practices and traditions that would require fundamental changes in every aspect of court life, including music. For you personally, Mary's triumph represented both challenge and opportunity. The Protestant musical styles that had dominated Edward's court were suddenly obsolete, requiring rapid adaptation to Catholic liturgical requirements that you had not worked with since the early years of Henry VIII's reign. But your early experience with Catholic musical traditions, combined with the compositional skills you had developed over 17 years of court service, positioned you to contribute significantly to the restoration of Catholic musical culture. Queen Mary's own musical preferences reflected both her religious convictions and her personal history. She favored the complex polyphonic compositions that had characterized Catholic liturgical music, and she was particularly interested in reviving the sophisticated musical traditions that had flourished in earlier periods of English Catholic culture. The challenge of adapting to Mary's requirements was both technical and philosophical. Catholic liturgical music operated according to different principles than the Protestant compositions that had dominated recent court musical life. The harmonic language was more complex, the structural requirements were more elaborate, and the relationship between musical and textual elements was more sophisticated. Your first major composition for Queen Mary was a setting of the Te Deum that drew upon the most advanced polyphonic techniques available to English composers while reflecting the restored Catholic liturgical requirements. The piece required you to recall and update skills that had been dormant for years, while incorporating the compositional advances you had made during the Protestant period. The premiere of this composition took place during one of the first major Catholic services held at court since Henry VIII's break with Rome. The performance was both artistically successful and politically significant, demonstrating that English musicians could create sophisticated Catholic music that served both liturgical and artistic purposes. Queen Mary's response to your work was notably positive. She expressed appreciation for both the technical sophistication and the religious sincerity that the composition demonstrated. Her approval provided crucial validation of your ability to serve the restored Catholic court while maintaining the artistic standards that had characterized your career. The broader implications of Mary's religious restoration affected every aspect of court life, creating opportunities and challenges that extended far beyond musical considerations. The return to Catholic practices required relearning ceremonial protocols, adapting to different social hierarchies, and navigating political currents that were both familiar and dramatically changed. Thomas Tallis, now in his early 70s, approached this latest transition with the wisdom and flexibility that had characterized his entire career. His ability to adapt once again to Catholic musical requirements while maintaining his artistic reputation provided a model for other court musicians who were struggling with the religious and cultural changes. For the musical household as a whole, Mary's accession meant reorganizing around Catholic liturgical needs while preserving the institutional knowledge and artistic capabilities that had been developed during the Protestant period. The challenge was integrating these different musical traditions into a coherent program that served the Queen's requirements while maintaining professional standards. Your own role in this reorganization was significant and valued. Your experience with both Catholic and Protestant musical traditions made you uniquely qualified to help bridge the gap between past and present requirements. Your compositional skills and institutional knowledge were crucial resources for a musical establishment that was adapting to dramatically changed circumstances. The commissions you received during Mary's early reign included some of the most challenging and prestigious musical projects of your career. Your settings of various Catholic liturgical texts were adopted for regular use in the royal chapel, and your ceremonial compositions were performed at major religious and state occasions throughout the kingdom. One particularly important project was creating music for Mary's coronation ceremony. The event required compositions that celebrated the new Queen's accession while acknowledging the religious restoration that her reign represented. The challenge was creating music that honored Catholic traditions while reflecting the specifically English character of Mary's monarchy. The success of your coronation music led to additional commissions for ceremonial and liturgical compositions that required similar sensitivity to complex religious and political considerations. Your ability to create sophisticated music that served both artistic and ideological purposes established your reputation as one of the most important composers of the Catholic Restoration. Queen Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain in 1554 brought additional cultural influences to the English court that affected musical life in significant ways. Spanish musical traditions and practices were introduced to court entertainment, creating opportunities for cultural exchange while also requiring adaptation to foreign aesthetic principles. Your experience with continental musical influences, developed during your earlier exploration of various European compositional techniques, proved valuable during this period of cultural fusion. Your ability to incorporate Spanish musical elements into English compositions helped create a distinctive musical style that reflected the international character of Mary's court. The musical household's evolution during Mary's reign demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that had characterized English court musical life throughout the Tudor period. Despite dramatic religious and political changes, the essential functions that music served in royal ceremonies and entertainment remained consistent, requiring professional skill and artistic sensitivity, regardless of specific cultural contexts. Your own development during this period reflected the broader themes that had characterized your entire court career. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining artistic integrity had allowed you to serve successfully under three very different monarchs with widely varying musical preferences and cultural requirements. The perspective that came with nearly 2 decades of court service allowed you to see Mary's reign within the broader context of English cultural development. The restoration of Catholic musical traditions was both a return to earlier practices and an opportunity for innovation that combined traditional elements with the artistic advances that had occurred during the Protestant period. Mary Tudor's death on November 17, 1558, marked the end of a reign that had attempted to reverse England's Protestant Reformation and restore Catholic religious and cultural traditions. Her death also began your final major career transition, as 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor's accession promised another dramatic shift in court culture and musical requirements. For you personally, Mary's death represented the loss of a patron who had appreciated and rewarded your ability to create sophisticated Catholic music that served both liturgical and artistic purposes. The 5 years of her reign had provided opportunities to revive and develop compositional skills that connected your work to the broader European tradition of Catholic musical excellence. Your own role within this environment was that of a senior composer and informal leader among the non-talus musicians. Your experience in adapting to changing court requirements and your proven ability to create high-quality music within various stylistic constraints made you a valuable resource for the musical establishment as a whole. The broader cultural changes that continued to reshape English society during Edward's reign created ongoing opportunities for musical innovation and development. The Protestant Reformation was maturing beyond its initial emphasis on simplicity and directness, allowing for more sophisticated artistic expression that served reformed religious principles while satisfying aesthetic requirements. Your compositions during this period reflected this cultural evolution. The music you created combined the clarity and accessibility that characterized Protestant musical ideals with the harmonic sophistication and structural complexity that demonstrated advanced compositional skill. The result was a body of work that served both immediate practical needs and long-term artistic goals. The commissions you received during this period included some of the most prestigious musical projects undertaken during Edward's reign. Your setting of the English liturgy was adopted for regular use in the royal chapel, and your ceremonial compositions were performed at major state occasions throughout the year. One particularly important project was a musical commemoration of the 3rd anniversary of Henry VIII's death. The composition required balancing respect for the deceased king's memory with acknowledgement of the religious and political changes that had occurred since his death. The challenge was creating music that honored the past while serving present needs. The success of this commemoration led to additional commissions for historical and ceremonial music that required similar sensitivity to complex political and cultural considerations. Your ability to navigate these challenges while maintaining artistic integrity established your reputation as a composer capable of handling the most delicate musical assignments. Queen Catherine Parr's influence on court culture continued, even after her death, through the scholarly traditions she had established and the artistic standards she had maintained. Many of the musical projects undertaken during Edward's reign reflected principles and approaches that had been developed during her time as queen. Your own artistic development had been significantly influenced by Catherine's patronage and encouragement. The sophisticated compositional techniques you had mastered and an intellectual approach to musical creation that characterized your mature style owed much to opportunities she had provided for serious artistic work. The perspective that came with achieving artistic maturity allowed you to see your individual career within the broader context of English musical development. The compositions you had created, the stylistic innovations you had contributed to, and the younger musicians you had influenced were all part of a cultural evolution that extended far beyond personal achievement. This broader perspective was both satisfying and challenging. It provided a sense of meaningful participation in historical processes that were larger than individual careers. But it also emphasized the responsibility to use your artistic abilities in ways that would contribute positively to long-term cultural development. The musical household's evolution during Edward's reign had created an environment where such Long-term thinking was possible and encouraged. The reduced political volatility and the increased emphasis on institutional stability allowed musicians to pursue artistic goals that extended beyond immediate survival and advancement. Your own position within this environment allowed you to begin thinking about the legacy you might leave through your compositions and your influence on younger musicians. The skills you had developed and the experience you had gained during your years of court service represented resources that could benefit future generations of English musicians. Thomas Tallis's example continued to inspire your approach to legacy building. His commitment to artistic excellence, his generosity in mentoring younger musicians, and his dedication to preserving and developing English musical traditions provided a model for how individual careers could contribute to broader cultural advancement. The last years of Edward VI's short reign, from 1551 to 1553, brought both artistic fulfillment and growing awareness that another major transition was approaching. The young king's health was beginning to show signs of the weakness that would eventually prove fatal, and the question of succession was creating political tensions that affected every aspect of court life. For you personally, these final years represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of court service. Your position as one of the senior composers in the royal musical establishment was secure and respected. Your artistic abilities had reached full maturity, and your influence on English musical development was substantial and lasting. The compositions you created during this period represented your most sophisticated work, combining technical mastery with the wisdom that came from years of experience in serving royal patrons with widely varying tastes and requirements. The music reflected both individual artistic achievement and deep understanding of the broader cultural forces that shaped English musical life. King Edward's own musical development had continued to progress throughout his teenage years. By 1552, he was 16 years old and had become a knowledgeable and discerning patron whose artistic judgment commanded respect from even the most experienced court musicians. His preferences continued to emphasize clarity and directness, but his appreciation for sophisticated compositional techniques had grown considerably. Your relationship with the teenage king during his final years was marked by mutual respect and genuine artistic collaboration. Edward occasionally requested specific types of compositions and engaged in substantive discussions about musical theory and practice that demonstrated his serious commitment to understanding music as both art and craft. The final composition you created specifically for Edward VI was a setting of Psalm 23 that combined melodic beauty with harmonic sophistication in ways that reflected both the king's maturing tastes and your own artistic development. The piece was performed during one of the last formal musical events of Edward's reign and became one of your most enduring works. Thomas Tallis, now approaching 70, had become a revered figure whose presence provided continuity and stability during a period of increasing political uncertainty. His advice and guidance were sought not only by musicians, but also by courtiers and government officials who valued his experience and judgment. The musical household during Edward's final years had achieved a level of artistic excellence and institutional stability that provided an example for musical establishments throughout England. The balance between individual achievement and collaborative effort that characterized the court's musical life influenced musical practices in noble households and religious institutions across the kingdom. Your own role in achieving this institutional excellence was significant and recognized. Your compositions had become part of the standard repertoire for court ceremonies. Your artistic judgment was regularly sought by colleagues and superiors, and your influence on the development of English musical style was substantial and lasting. Growing awareness that Edward's reign might be ending created pressures and uncertainties that affected everyone at court. The question of succession was complicated by religious and political considerations that could dramatically alter the direction of English cultural development. For musicians, these uncertainties created familiar anxieties about adaptation to new circumstances. Your own preparation for whatever transitions might come drew upon nearly 2 decades of experience in adapting to changing court requirements. The skills you had developed in reading political currents, adjusting to new royal preferences, and maintaining artistic integrity under varying constraints provided confidence that you could successfully navigate another major transition. The death of King Edward VI on July 6, 1553, marked the end of an era that had been characterized by religious reform, cultural innovation, and relative political stability. The young king's death at age 15 was both a personal tragedy and a political crisis that would reshape English society in fundamental ways. For the musical household, Edward's death represented the loss of an intelligent and supportive patron who had encouraged artistic development while maintaining the institutional stability that allowed serious musical work to flourish. His appreciation for sophisticated musical composition and his commitment to cultural excellence had created an environment where court musicians could achieve their highest artistic potential. Your own reaction to Edward's death was complex and deeply felt. The young king had been not just a patron, but also something approaching a musical collaborator whose intelligence and artistic sensibility had inspired some of your best work. His loss represented both personal grief and professional uncertainty about what might come next. The compositions spread across your desk tell the story of England's religious and cultural transformation through music. Here are your elaborate polyphonic masses from Henry's early reign, when Catholic traditions still dominated court life. There are the simpler, more direct pieces you created for Edward VI's Protestant court, emphasizing clarity and congregational participation. Your return to complex liturgical music during Mary's Catholic Restoration sits alongside the sophisticated yet accessible compositions you have begun creating for Elizabeth's court, which demands both artistic excellence and reformed religious sensibility. Each piece represents not just musical achievement but survival strategy, the ability to read political currents, anticipate royal preferences, and adapt your artistic voice to serve changing masters without losing your essential identity as a composer. You have become a musical chameleon, changing colors to match each new environment while somehow maintaining the core of who you are as an artist. The cost has been enormous. You have suppressed dangerous musical ideas, avoided friendships that might prove politically hazardous, and learned to create art within constraints that would have seemed impossible when you first arrived at court. The spontaneous joy of musical creation has been tempered by the constant calculation of political safety. Every note you write must serve not just artistic purposes, but also survival needs. Yet you have also achieved something remarkable. Your music has been performed before 5 monarchs, heard by thousands of courtiers, and copied by musicians throughout England who seek to emulate the sophisticated style of royal court music. Your compositions have helped define what English music can be during this transformative period in the nation's history. The young musicians who now seek your guidance remind you of yourself 24 years ago. Ambitious, talented, naive about the realities of court life. You try to prepare them for the challenges they will face, to teach them the skills that extend beyond musical technique into the realm of psychological and political survival. Remember, you tell them that in the Tudor court, every performance is a political act. Every choice of repertoire sends a message. Every musical relationship can become dangerous if circumstances change. Your primary instrument is not the lute or the viol. It is your ability to read the currents of power and adapt accordingly. But you also remind them that adaptation need not mean artistic compromise. The greatest musicians in this court have been those who found ways to serve royal needs while preserving their artistic integrity. Survival and excellence are not contradictory goals. They require each other. Thomas Tallis, now 81 and still composing, still performing, still serving as the musical conscience of the court, embodies this philosophy. His career has spanned 60 years and 5 reigns, and his music remains fresh, relevant, and deeply personal, despite all the political accommodations it has required. His example proves that it is possible to serve power while maintaining artistic soul. As you prepare for bed on this cold winter night, you reflect on the strange journey that brought you from the desperate young man seeking employment in 1536 to the established court composer of 1560. The path has been marked by terror and triumph, loss and achievement, moral compromise and artistic breakthrough. Tomorrow you will wake to serve Queen Elizabeth, whose intelligence and cultural sophistication promise both opportunities and challenges that you cannot yet imagine. Her reign may last for decades, requiring new adaptations and artistic evolution that will test everything you have learned about survival in the Tudor court. The lute that replaced your broken instrument 24 years ago sits in the corner of your chamber, its strings catching the firelight like silver threads connecting past and future. That instrument is played for kings and queens, has provided music for weddings and funerals, has accompanied both celebrations and executions. It is also played for you in the quiet moments when court duties were finished and you could explore musical ideas simply for the joy of discovery. Those private musical moments have kept alive the part of your soul that first fell in love with music long before you understood the dangerous complexities of court life. The balance between public service and private artistic satisfaction has defined your career and your life. You have learned to create meaningful music within impossible constraints, to find personal expression through art that must serve political purposes, to maintain humanity while navigating an essentially inhuman system. The screaming that welcomed you to court life has long since faded into memory, replaced by the more subtle but no less challenging sounds of political intrigue, artistic competition, and the constant low-level anxiety that characterizes life in proximity to absolute power. You have learned to hear music in these sounds too. The rhythms of court protocol, the harmonies of successful adaptation, the melodies of survival. As sleep finally claims you, your last conscious thought is of the music yet to be written, the challenges yet to be faced, the young queen whose reign promises to reshape England in ways that no one can predict. Your career has been built on adaptation and survival, skills that will serve you well in whatever changes lie ahead. The broken lute string that began this journey was, you now understand, not a disaster but a gift. It taught you immediately that in the Tudor court, perfection is temporary, control is illusory, and survival depends on the ability to continue making music even when your instrument or your world breaks unexpectedly. That lesson has served you well through 24 years of court life, and it will serve you still in whatever years remain. The music continues, the court endures, and somewhere in the darkness of the palace, other young musicians are learning the strange art of creating beauty in the service of power. Your breathing deepens as sleep approaches, and in your dreams, you hear not the screaming that once terrified you, but the sound of lutes and voices raised in harmony, creating music that transcends the political circumstances of its creation to touch something eternal in the human spirit. This is what you have learned in your years as a Tudor court musician, that art can survive anything, that beauty can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that even in the most dangerous and corrupt environments. The human capacity for creating meaning through music remains undiminished. The story that began with a broken string ends not with silence, but with the promise of music yet to be made, melodies yet to be discovered, and harmonies yet to be explored. In the Tudor court, survival itself is a form of art, and you have become a master of both, the candle gutters and dies, leaving you in darkness, lit only by the dying embers of your fire. But in that darkness, the music plays on, in your memory, in your dreams, and in the compositions that will outlive you to tell future generations the story of what it meant to make music in the most dangerous and magnificent court in Europe. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, new demands for adaptation and survival. But tonight, for these few hours of sleep, you are simply a musician who has learned to create beauty despite everything the world has thrown at him. And in that achievement, small though it may seem against the grand sweep of Tudor history, lies a victory that no king or queen can take away from you. The music endures, the art survives, and somewhere in the palace, the sound of your compositions echoes through chambers where power resides, adding beauty to a world that too often forgets its necessity. This is the strange life of a Tudor court musician, dangerous and rewarding, terrifying and magnificent, destructive and creative in equal measure. It is a life that few would choose if they understood its true costs, but one that, having been lived, reveals truths about art, power, and human resilience that could be learned no other way. The lute string that snapped so dramatically in 1536 has been replaced many times over the years, but the music it helped create continues to resonate through the corridors of power, a testament to the human capacity to find beauty and meaning even in the most unlikely circumstances. And so ends another day in the strange, dangerous, magnificent life of a musician in the court of the Tudors, where survival is an art form and art is a form of survival, and where the sound of a breaking string can mark the beginning of a journey that changes not just a career, but a soul.